Hey, it's May 27th, and we find ourselves in 1 Chronicles, chapters 26 through 29, as well as Psalm 127. There's a phrase that says, a place for everything and everything in its place. Now, that's really, really nice if it's true, and because everything's exactly where you want it to be and you know where to look for it. But it takes a lot of effort to do that. But what if that was already done for you, and everything you needed was exactly where it should be and where you knew it would be? That's the situation that Solomon actually finds himself in as he assumes the throne. As we get into the passage, the scribe Ezra is finishing describing the religious, political, and military assignments that David put in place as Solomon was about to take up the throne. In chapter 26, it describes the appointing of the temple gatekeepers, or the guards, the treasurers, as well as officers and judges for the rest of Israel. Chapter 27 describes the military leaders and the tribal leaders and then other civil leaders all throughout Israel. In chapter 28, David addresses all the leaders. He told them that he had wanted to build a temple for God, but God told him no because he was a man of war. Now, God also never asked David to build a temple in the first place, but that's what David wanted to do. However, God would choose Solomon, David's son, to be the next king and would allow Solomon to build the temple that David wanted. And God promised to establish Solomon's kingdom if Solomon continued to follow God's commands as David did. David then charged Israel to seek and follow God so that they could continue to live in the land that God had promised and given them. Now here's again that looking back perspective that we get from Chronicles. Spoiler alert, Solomon would not follow God with his whole heart like David did, which begins the slow decline of Israel, which ultimately led to God allowing the Assyrians and the Babylonians to take them captive in the first place. David then charges Solomon to follow God with his whole heart, to build the temple, which again, David had given him everything he needed to build it, plans, materials, laborers, everything. And he told Solomon to be strong and courageous because God was with him, number one, and the Levites and the rest of Israel was with him. He wasn't alone in leading the nation. In chapter 29, David and Israel's leaders gave offerings of gold and silver and bronze and iron and precious stones of their own to also be used in the building of the temple. And when they saw how much was given, they rejoiced at the generosity and the free will that they had given these things to God's temple. David then prayed in front of everyone. He acknowledged that everything ultimately was God's anyway, and it was God who had made Israel great, not him, not anybody else. David then prayed that Solomon would follow God with his whole heart, and Israel offers sacrifices and celebrates all that God had done for them. Solomon is then anointed king publicly, and Zadok continues as the high priest. And overall, you look at Solomon's reign, Israel followed him and obeyed, and God made Solomon into a great king. And then the chapter closes with David dying. However, we will get more details about David's death and the beginning of Solomon's reign when we get into 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. Ezra is being very selective here of what he's telling the returned exiles from Babylon. Our reading today, though, closes with Psalm 127, a song of ascents that Solomon himself actually wrote. And in it he says, "Nothing lasts and is meaningless if God is not in it, and that children are a blessing from God." Now, these are truths that Solomon would learn in his lifetime from personal experience and unfortunately at great personal cost, as we will see. So what can we take away from today's passages? First, David put an entire support system in place for his son Solomon that set him up for success. The church for us is that support system that God gives us to set us up for success in his plan. Second, Solomon was supposed to follow God with his whole heart as David did. And if he did, God promised to establish his son Rehoboam on the throne for his entire life. There are blessings for obedience and there are consequences for disobedience. And what we often forget is they affect far more people for far longer than we realize. And third, unless God is in something, it's not worth doing. There are many things that God had planned for Solomon, which he did, but he also wasted a lot of his time pursuing things that he discovered were meaningless. Ephesians 2:10 tells us today that God has set up good works in advance for us to do. And 1 Corinthians 12 tells us that God has equipped us with spiritual gifts to accomplish them. We would do well to pursue God's plans for our lives. which last, and not waste our time with things that really ultimately don't matter. My prayer for us today is that we would follow God with our whole heart, as David did, and that we would be a part of and rely on God and His church, God's support system for us, and that we'd pursue God's will for our lives, knowing He has planned and equipped us for success. If you haven't done so already, please download our Through the Bible reading plan at DespairyCommunityChurch.org/throughthebible. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.